Our love of what is beautiful does not lead to extravagance. Our love of the things of the mind does not make us soft. We regard wealth as something to be properly used, rather than as something to boast about. As for poverty, no one need be ashamed to admit it. The real shame is not taking practical measures to escape from it. Here, each individual is interested not only in his own affairs, but in the affairs of the state as well. Even those who are mostly occupied with their own business are extremely well informed on general politics. This is a peculiarity of ours. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all. We Athenians, in our own persons, take our decisions on policy or submit them to proper discussions, for we do not think that there is an incompatibility between words and deeds. The worst thing is to rush into action before the consequences have been properly debated. And this is another point where we differ from other people. We are capable at the same time of taking risks and of estimating them beforehand. Others are brave out of ignorance, and when they stop to think, they begin to fear. But the man who can most truly be accounted brave is he who best knows the meaning of what is sweet in life and what is terrible, and then goes out undeterred to meet what is to come. That is from Pericles' funeral oration, which you can find in The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Welcome, my friends, welcome to stately Vaughan Manor and the Sunday Penguin, once again, the Sunday Penguin, where we are talking about, once again, Thucydides. I've talked about this fellow before, Thucydides, the second great Greek historian. But I thought there was more to say, so here I am about to say it. So yeah, I made a video about Thucydides before where I immediately called him a great Roman historian. See, this is what happens when you don't edit and you just make a video and then just put it up. You make mistakes. So I'll try not to make any dopey mistakes like that. Thucydides, the second great Greek historian, he came after Herodotus. Herodotus chronicled the history of the Persian Wars, where the Greeks beat off the Persians. They got together, well, enough of them got together to beat off the Persians and keep the Persians from invading and conquering Greece, which was a great accomplishment and one to be proud of. And Herodotus was justly proud of it. And he wrote this great history that also talked all about the different cultures, and a lot of other things were in that history, folk tales, all kinds of stuff were in the histories of Herodotus. Now, Thucydides was a very different historian, and I want to get a little bit more into that today with this discussion of Thucydides. Thucydides, who was born probably somewhere around 460 BC and died somewhere around 400 BC. The Peloponnesian War that he was writing about went from 431 to 404 BC. So he took part in this war. He was a general in the Peloponnesian War. He was around for the whole thing. And he paid a lot of attention to what was going on. So he lived through this war. And when he was writing this history, he took a lot of pains to check and double check the facts, which was unusual at the time. Now, history was still very, very young. There were no rules of history. And you get the sense from this book that he did respect the work of Herodotus, but there were things about Herodotus that he criticized. And so when he wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War, he did it in a very different way. Now, the Peloponnesian War was devastating. It was for ancient Greece. It exhausted ancient Greece. And it was the war between two great superpowers in Greece. So Greece wasn't one nation at the time. It was a collection of different city-states that could all be very different from each other, although they were united by language and culture to a certain degree. Even though they could be very different culturally. The Spartans were very different from the Athenians. So Sparta was a great power. Athens was a great power. Athens had formed itself into an empire after the Persian Wars. It used its position as the leader of the defenders of the Greeks after the war, and they had a league that was dedicated to preventing Persia from ever trying to conquer Greece again. But they used that to form an empire, and they took over all of these Greek city-states when the Greek city-states were afraid that Persia would take them over. So basically, Athens became a conqueror, in a way, and built up this empire, and they were a great sea power, whereas Sparta was more of a land power. They had a great land army. And they were very different culturally. All the other Greek states, when these two went to war, had to choose sides. They had to decide whether they were going to be on Sparta's side or Athens' side. And it became a huge, like I said, a huge world war within Greece. And it was a horrifying war where, you know, in all wars, terrible things happen. But very often in ancient histories, you don't see all of that quite as clearly as you see in this one. This is an account that gives you a very realistic view of a war. With Herodotus, very often it had a kind of a storybook quality to it. He was writing about a lot of real things, but then he was writing about a lot of stuff that wasn't real as well. Like I said, he would put folk tales and other things in his history. And one of the things that he did is if he read an account of something and he didn't believe the account, he'd give it to you anyway and say, well, this is what I heard. I think it's crazy, but here it is. Thucydides didn't do that. He didn't believe in that kind of history. He wanted to give you what he believed was the most accurate version of what happened. And he was in a good position to do this because, like I said, he was in the war. He saw it firsthand. And what he didn't see, he researched. He spoke to people who took part in things that he didn't take part in. He was in a good position for this because he was a general in the war, and he failed to protect a city that a lot of the Greeks felt he should have protected, and he just couldn't do it. And he says that matter-of-factly in the book. He doesn't try to gloss over this at all. And he was exiled, and he spent a lot of time in southern Greece, around Sparta. So he was able to kind of see both sides of this conflict and speak to people who were on both sides of the conflict. And a lot of horrible things happened in this war, and he talks about it. And he talks about the breakdown of society and how that happens during a war. And you really get a sense of reality from this that you didn't from Herodotus in a way. In a way, in Herodotus, because there was so much stuff that we knew can't be true, you felt a little distant from it sometimes. You don't in this. This is a lot more immediate. You recognize immediately reading this that, oh wow, these are real people, this really happened. Because the way Thucydides did it was different than Herodotus. Herodotus believed in things like gods and goddesses and their influence on human beings. And he often thought that things that happened were a result of gods. And he believed in omens and other things. Thucydides, you get the sense, didn't believe any of that. He was looking for realistic, real world reasons for why things happened. Probably the most demonstrative of that is the Greek plague, the plague that hit Athens, the Athenian plague. During the war, whenever Sparta would come to attack Athens, Athens would go behind the walls. And they were all crowded behind the walls in the city of Athens. And it was a place where, well, a plague could very easily break out, and one did. And it was a terrible plague, which actually Thucydides contracted. He contracted this plague, and he survived it. And he talks about this plague and describes it in detail, and it sounds terrible. And it killed a lot of Athenians, including Pericles, the chief politician of the city, who had been directing a lot of how Athens had fought the war. Now, if Herodotus was writing about this, doubtless he would blame a lot of it on a god being angry and using this to teach the Greeks a lesson or to punish them or something. A lot of Greek historians, if they had written this account, they would say something like that. Thucydides doesn't, And this is the thing where, of course, a lot of the people in Athens were blaming on the gods or thought the gods were responsible. We're looking to supernatural explanations for this. I mean, people still do that kind of thing, so it only makes sense that they did it back then. But Thucydides was like, no, this was a plague, and this is what happened. But he doesn't blame it on gods, right? He doesn't blame it on the supernatural. He never does throughout this whole thing. And that's one of the reasons that this seems so realistic. And also because we recognize ourselves in this. These are people just like us. They have a different culture. They lived in a different time, but they're human beings like us. We are no smarter than the Greeks were at this time. We have a lot more knowledge, but we're not different. And Thucydides was pointing out in this, one of the things he pointed out in this is that people never change. People always have the same motivations. And this war will always happen because people are the way that they are. And that was a part of this. And nations do what they do because of self-interest, mostly. And that's a part of this as well. That's one of the reasons this is still studied today. He's saying a lot of things in this that have been true since this time. And a lot of the details of the fighting and the suffering and the things that people were going through, we have seen in war after war after war since this time. But this is probably the first time you ever saw such a gritty account of a war. There are problems with this. And that is, you have no other source for this war. And Thucydides, since he was trying to get everything accurate according to himself, any mistakes that he might have made or any biases he might have had, they're hard to know what alternatives might have been to those, It's hard to know where he was wrong, because he had to be wrong about some of it. But there are no alternative accounts. That's one thing that Herodotus had. If he heard two different stories, he'd tell you two different stories and let you make your own ideas about them. He didn't. He was trying to figure it out and give you what he felt was the real deal. But you have no other alternatives to that. So he has been criticized for that. But at the same time, very important and a great book. And as I've said, a real one. This gives you such a sense of the reality of what was going on at this point in history in Greece. And that's probably all I have to say about Herodotus at this time. That's all. See, this is what I'm saying. This is all I have to say about Thucydides at this time. Catch me next time for the next Sunday Penguin next week. And catch me tomorrow here at Stately Vaughan Manor when I talk about something very different. Okay, guys. Bye.